All right, we got about 50 folks online so far, so I think that's a quorum, and we'll go ahead and get started just in the interest of time. Um, Thanks everybody for joining. For those of you who I haven't met, Mike Lipnick, part of the Open Oximetry project team. Special thanks to Lily Ortiz for helping us get this
Your
collaborative
phone
community
charger
meeting
handy.
together. We haven't met in quite a while, but there's a lot that's been happening in the pulse-ox space. For those of you who are new to the collaborative community,
Mm.
this was started in an effort to try and bring everybody together to share what's going on in real time related to issues of improving performance of pulse oximetry, improving equitable performance of these devices and the applications beyond pulse ox as well, trying to create a venue where people could come together across academics, industry, regulatory, and try and share stuff in real time because we know there's a lot going on. Publications are slow to get out, and we thought having a forum where we could share ideas maybe might help accelerate some stuff in this space. Uh, there have been a lot of changes in global funding, global politics, global everything. So we got a little off track in the last year, but we're hoping to get back on track a little bit and have some more regular meetings so we can share. Um, One of the reasons for the meeting today in particular was the recent release of ISO 8601 2026. So we're excited to be joined by Bob and Sandy who'll share about that. But before we get into the lineup, just a couple of housekeeping things here. Um, if you could, please edit your name in the Zoom just to list your organizational affiliation if you're willing, just so people know who's here, so folks can connect. Also, please stay on mute if you're not presenting or if you're not talking. We will have some discussion at the end. We are recording these meetings and we do post them publicly on YouTube so people can watch. So just keep that in mind when you're putting anything in the chat or when you're speaking. Um, Everything is on the openoximetry.org website /community. And if you want to invite others to join, or if you got this link forwarded to you and you want to join, you can also join the community online. The agenda today is pretty packed. We're going to have a handful of 5-minute chats. There was some last minute changes. We were trying to focus, again, the new ISO 8601 came out, so we really wanted to focus the meeting around that, but there were lots of different um, uh, folks who were there were lots of different folks doing things, so please don't feel excluded. We really would like to invite you to present at a future meeting. So another thing I would ask in the chat, and we'll keep track of this, if you could include in the chat if you have recent publications that you want to share that we haven't published yet on our website where we're trying to keep track of everybody's work, please put the links in there and we'll add those to the website. Also, if you have upcoming research projects or updates on ongoing research projects that you think would be great to share in a future meeting, please go ahead and put in the chat a little blurb about that. We'll keep track and then we'll make sure you get on the invite list and the agenda for a future meeting. So for today's meeting, we're going to get some updates from the new Uganda Hypoxia Lab from Dr. Sindagiri and colleagues. Dr. Alice Monk's going to share some exciting updates about the Monk scale. We're going to hear from collaborators at the FDA on a new flow phantom that they've been working on. Some updates from Dr. Hendrickson about the EquiOx study findings. Also, some new findings that were just published out of UC Davis in the neonatal population. Uh, and then Dr. Loff is going to talk about what's on the horizon with some of the OpenOx data, what's going on there. And then the majority of the time we're going to spend going through some of the new ISO standard updates from Bob and Sandy. And then hopefully we'll have some time for open discussion. It's going to be jam-packed. If we do run out of time, put your questions in the chat as we're going. We'll try and keep track and moderate those, and we may just have to have another meeting and follow up. But thanks for joining. So without further ado, maybe Dr. Sindagiri, if you want to get ready to start sharing your slides, and we can start off with your presentation.
All right,
And
thanks, Mike.
again, yeah, thanks, Cornell. Over to you.
All right. So I hope you can see my slides. Am I on?
All good.
All right. So I'm Cornelius Sendagere and biologist, consultant at the Uganda Heart Institute. I'm also a lecturer at Makerere University and the co-PI at the Uganda Hypoxia Lab, and I'll just which is now open for for the studies that we are currently doing. So basically, the lab is more or less the same as the lab at UCSF, perhaps with bigger space, like Mike said. Basically, same equipment, protocols, and then of course the staff training and the data analysis all the same. We basically do the same ISO 17020 specs as the UCSF Hypoxia Lab, and the first studies started this year in January 2026. And as you can see there, as part of the team, Fred and Emmanuel and our CRC. So it's located in Uganda, in the heart of Kampala. And in case you want to visit us, there are hotels, very many hotels nearby the Hypoxia Lab. We are located in a very premium place. In case including the giraffes, in case you're interested. So the Hypoxia Lab in Uganda is basically doing sponsored studies as well. Basically, the desaturation studies that we do with two blood gas analyzers, trying to compare with the SpO2 that we use the pulse oximeters in the lab, is basically what we try to do to do the studies. So we also skin pigment to improve methodology for pigment characterization. Largely dark-skinned participants. We do performance assessments for the pulse oximeters for local available probes and pulse oximeters. So far, we've had more than 100 people up for this. I think I may actually be underestimating this, maybe more than 200. Philip can correct me. And we've so far screened more than 50 and completed the enrollment for them. For the studies that we've done so far, about, I think, 13 participants, if I'm not mistaken, have been studied since January. And as you can see, the ITAs for them compared to those in UCSF, slightly. And then, of course, if you look at the Monk scale distribution in Uganda, between H, I, and J. So that's the distribution that we currently have. This is the study team, myself, Dr. Mike Lipnick, and then Dr. Fred Bulam, who you saw in the previous image, and then Dr. Tyler Law came out when we did about 10 participants, or 12, if I'm not mistaken. And then Philip is our clinical research coordinator, and Emmanuel, Dr. Emmanuel Aporu is our Lifebox fellow, who is going to be with us for the foreseeable future, I hope, to help us out with these studies. So I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that this gives you some insight into the Uganda Hypoxia Lab. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cornell, and congrats to the Uganda team for getting this up and running, and for the many teams who have been supporting that initiative. Please go ahead and put questions in the chat, and we'll circle back to those for the Hypoxia Lab team. Next up, we're going to go over to Dr. Ellis Monk. Ellis, if you want to share screen or just jump into.
Just talk. So yeah, thank you all. It's been so long since I've seen some of your faces, so really cool. I'll just give a quick, update on the MST itself and some research projects, and then I'll talk about the Pantone aspect of this. So I dropped in a couple of links in the chat about some research things that have been cropping up with the Monk skin tone scale in the past 6 to 9 months or so. One thing is that there's a Gates Foundation funded study right now across Africa where they've effectively replaced the transcutaneous bilirubin detector with my scale and something they're calling a biliruler. And so far, they've screened about 930 infants for jaundice. And the result thus far is that they've had 0 deaths, actually, once they've moved over to this new screening protocol using my scale and the biliruler. So that's very exciting. And I'll be in contact with some of those people pretty soon. There's also a paper that I'm writing with a nurse, actually, who implemented the MST at a hospital in LA. The whole idea there is to try to reduce hospital-acquired pressure injuries, ulcers, bed sores, those sorts of things. Kills 60,000 people a year, $27 billion a year problem. As I'm sure many of you know, this is a really huge issue, particularly with people with darker skin. It's harder to detect these skin injuries until they're too late. The main finding in that paper is 94% reduction in hospital-acquired pressure injuries once they moved over to the protocol using my scale. Printed out $2 badge buddies and some nurse training. Pretty big return on investment, I would say. So that's another thing that I've been up to with the scale as well, is kind of moving into other applications for the scale across the medical space. In terms of Pantone, it took them a year to make finally these things. This is the official Pantone print of the MST. I have close to 1,000 of them. One reason why it took so long is because their Pantone system was limited, meaning that it didn't really go dark enough, it didn't go light enough. And when I did some investigating, what I realized along the way, and there's a paper I'm co-writing right now about this issue, the C-Lab system is an industrial color matching system. So it's not really totally appropriate for human skin, which is translucent, which has subsurface scattering. And, it's fine if you're lighter skinned, you can kind of be in this range in the C-Lab system. But, once you go outside, you get a little darker, you start to see how the C-Lab system becomes rapidly inappropriate. And that is actually why the Pantone process, they had to mix new paints, brand new paints, just to try to match the Monk skin tone scale. So that, is somewhat surprising to me, what the learning the color science and doing all this stuff kind of unearthed. But the kind of long story short is that the C-Lab system, ITA, I know a lot of people are wed to it, but it's an industrial color matching system, and it doesn't seem to be appropriate, particularly when we want to include people of all different types of skin tones. Once you do that, you start to see how that system is inadequate, and you need to kind of move beyond it. And this is something I learned working with Pantone. So these things are going to be available. You can email me. I'm going to set up a system where you all can kind of request these things, hopefully just 3 at a time, because I'm just gonna, do it myself at first. But you guys can start requesting these; they exist, and I will subsidize this first wave. I'll just send them out to you. So you send me your request, and I'll mail them your way. So if you have any questions for that, just email me, emunk@fas.harvard.edu. You can Google me and get my email. But they are live; they're available. There they are. So thank you.
Thanks, Ellis. That's great. Congrats on all the work. And it sounds like a lot going on, and took a lot to get that to this point. So, and thanks for the generosity in getting those out.
Yeah, I'll just say it cost me 6 figures out of my own research.
Well,
But
yeah,
whatever. It's all good. It's all good.
no,
Yep.
commitment. Appreciate it.
No problem. No problem.
Thanks for sharing all that. All right, next up, we're going to go over to Linda and the FDA team. Thanks for joining. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chi Li. I'm currently an ORISE Fellow at FDA. Today, I'm going to share with you our research about the flow Phantom test platform for characterizing the pulse oximeter performance. So, as we are all aware, the pulse ox testing has certain limitations. For example, it can be difficult in practice to achieve the wider saturation ranges or low percent modulations. So, a non-clinical testing method is needed to complement the clinical testing and potentially reduce the post-ox testing, which is our goal here to develop a flexible test platform consisting of a marked cardiovascular flow loop and the tissue phantom for evaluating the pulse oximeter performance. So to achieve this, we have like 2 approaches. One, we first developed and characterized an optomechanical finger simulating phantom with biologically relevant geometry. And second, we constructed and verified the flow system integrated with this finger phantom. So here we present our finger simulating phantom. In particular, it includes a U-shaped channel designed to mimic the blood vessel in the finger. And on the bottom, we also show the epidermal layers containing different melanin fraction percentage. And on the right here, we show our marked cardiovascular flow loop. And two key components I want to point out is one, we use the bovine blood in this research, and the second, we also include the gas input system to manipulate the oxygen saturation levels. And so first, we verified that our system is actually capable of one, generating the physiological pressure waveforms from 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury. And two, we were able to achieve the wide range of pulse modulation levels from 0.2 to 8%. And three, we were able to extend the range of the oxygen saturations from 100 all the way down to 40%. And now that we understand the capabilities of our system, the next step that we're trying to do is to verify the pulse oximeter performance using this platform. So here we show the few clinical pulse oximeters we use for verification. And then we compare the obtained result with the data previously published on the OpenOx website as illustrated in the dot plot showing here. So here we are showing some of the results that we have. So first, we observed that as the perfusion index decreased, the pulse oximeter showed the reduced accuracy in SpO2 measurement. And we also calculated the ARMS values and the bias values from our data, which compared with the prior clinical studies, the overall ARMS values were comparable. And we also observed the negative bias across all three devices. So what are we actually showing here is that we were able to generate the result that is comparable to a clinical study. And furthermore, we also evaluated our system under the various modulation levels and skin pigmentations. So across all devices, we observed that at low perfusion index, the bias increased as the melanin fraction increased. And this trend is actually consistent with the data previously reported in the literature. So based on this result, we have developed a marked cardiovascular flow system, which we were able to verify that it can generate the physiological pressure waveform. We could also achieve the extended SO2 percentage as well as the pulse modulation levels. So this kind of indicate that our system has the potential to become an effective non-clinical testing tool. But we're still currently working on it to improve our system. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation. And with that, I'd like to thank all the colleagues who are assisting in this research, and we will be happy to take any question you may have at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing. Interesting work. Yeah, so please put questions into the chat for the team. I imagine, FDA team was presenting some original research here. I think a question that's on all of our minds is where's the 510K guidance and when's that's going to come out? We don't have any updates on that we are able to share at this point. I haven't heard anything. I don't think there's anybody on the call who has any updates, but just in case that is a series of chat questions that are about to come, just sort of catching that before we have a thread going there. Okay, so moving on, up next, Dr. Hendrickson, over to you.
Okay. Sorry about that. All right, can you guys...
We're seeing your presenter view.
Presenter view. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me try again. Is that better?
Yep, we see your enrollment and subgroup slide. Yep.
All right, so very quickly, I'm going to share with you the results from the EquiOx study, and I just want to say that I'm sharing on behalf of a lot of people who contributed to this work. I'm going to try to be fast and just say that this is a large prospective study of critically ill adults in the ICU at one center in San Francisco. All these patients had arterial lines, and we enrolled between 2022 and 2024 with directly observed simultaneous SpO2 and SaO2 measurements. Today, I'm going to focus on sharing with you the full cohort data from 631 patients, 1,760 observations, And I'll say that we did multiple subgroup analyses, looking at them as sensitivity analyses to see if our findings changed substantially when we culled the data for sort of some specific areas of interest. We had a patient population that was median age 62 years with lots of comorbidities. Most people were mechanically ventilated. Most were on vasopressors. We had a low median perfusion index of 1. We have a diverse population with a spread across different race and ethnicity groups. But our skin pigment data shows that we are lacking representation in the darkest skin pigment categories. And then you'll also note that our median SpO2 was quite high. Remember, this is done after the pandemic in normal staffing settings. And so quite a different circumstance than those publications that came out in the early 2020 era. The big story here is that we found negative pulse oximeter bias. And this was different from, I think, what a lot of people expected to find and what some previous studies have shown, but it's actually in line with other prospective cohort studies. So I think this rounds out some of the narrative around bias that's seen in prospective cohorts. So you'll also note that the magnitude of bias was just negative 1.7% with a confidence interval of negative 2.8 to negative 0.5%. That's the median bias. But what I'd like to show you is some of the raw data. And these are violin plots. On the in the blue, you'll see the Monk skin tone scale, and on the right side is green, and that's ITA. So we have both subjective and objective skin pigment data here. 0 is no bias, and everything above that line is a positive bias, meaning the pulse oximeter is reading too high. I'll remind you that that's when patients are at risk of missed hypoxemia, where the pulse oximeter may be falsely reassuring. And fully 20% of our observations were in this positive bias range. And that's problematic because we know a negative bias protects against the clinician missing hypoxemia. And so all of these readings are putting someone at risk of the clinician missing real hypoxemia. I'll say that the people who had, or the observations with positive bias were more common in patients with dark skin, patients who identified as Black, and patients with comorbidities that you would suspect would cause chronic vascular disease. And then these are our adjusted estimates of bias by both skin pigment and race. And I'll summarize this by saying the darkest skin pigment group had a relatively more positive adjusted bias compared to the lighter skin pigment groups. And then lastly, I'll share with you that the ARMS in the full cohort was 3.9. This is worse than what we see in laboratory studies, and particularly striking because I'll remind you that we were studying mostly SATs in the 90s, and those controlled desaturation studies go down to saturations in the 70s. So we're studying the oximeter in the range where it would be expected to perform at its best, and it's still performing with less accuracy in the critically ill patients. So just in summary, the median bias was negative. The SpO2 was reading too low, and it was less negative or less protective against missed hypoxemia in participants with darker skin. I'm just going to skip through some of this in the interest of time. And I'll say that we are working on getting this published. And I think I'm submitting our revise and resubmit to CHEST Critical Care this afternoon. So I'll end there and then take questions later or look at the chat.
Thanks, Carolyn, for sharing that. There is preprint that's online for those of you who want to read, and then the raw data for that study will go into the PhysioNet data repository in the coming weeks, so you can keep an eye out there if you want to evaluate it. Before we move on to the next speaker, we did have one other speaker who wasn't able to join today, but just want to highlight their study. For those of you who haven't seen it, Dan Martin and the UK group had another large prospective study that recently came out with some interesting findings that in some ways mirrored some of the stuff that was found in Dr. Hendrickson's study. But food for thought, I think hopefully in the next Open Ox meeting, Dan and his team will be able to join to share what they found and what they're up to next. So moving on, we'll go to Dr. Safkees. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name there,
Very close.
but thanks
That's
for
okay.
joining. Over to you with your new study from the NICU.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Heather Sifkis, you were so close.
Almost got
Pediatric intensivist from UC Davis. My first time joining this meeting, so thank you very much. Are you seeing my slides here?
Yep, all good.
Great. Presenting our work that was recently published, neonatal pulse oximetry accuracy and disparities by skin pigmentation, or our shortened version of neopods. So I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room, obviously, that the FDA warning regarding pulse oximetry accuracy overestimates oxygen saturation in darker patients. However, most of the studies were retrospective with a time gap between those measurements using race as a proxy. And then relative for me, most of these were done in older patients as well. So we set out to do a prospective neonatal study with an objective skin pigmentation to measure the accuracy. We use the Delphin skin color catch device, mostly focusing on the ITA as our primary measurement for skin pigmentation. I'm just going to jump into our results. We enrolled 100 infants, of which we analyzed 70 of them, which that contributed 136 closely matched pulse ox and blood gas pairs. It was a pretty premature population with a median gestational age of 28 weeks. Pretty young too, around 51 hours of age. We only enrolled up to 10 days of life. And most of these babies, just because they had an arterial catheter, was just in the first couple of days of life. We had a decently diverse population. 40% of the infants were Black. It was a pretty sick population though too, with almost half of them receiving a blood transfusion at some point during their enrollment, and over a third of them even in fact receiving blood transfusion before they even had that first pulse ox measurement pairing done. So this is an image showing our overall bias. Kind of similarly to what's been presented, our mean bias overall, the range was actually a negative bias, close to -1, and throughout across all saturation ranges. When we looked at this relative to skin pigmentation, so on the bottom there, I'm showing you lighter to darker for the ITA, that bias actually became more negative. The red line here showing you the linear fit for our patients, as opposed to the opposite of the hypothesis that it would get more positive as the skin got darker. We actually saw that it got more negative as the skin got darker. This was not statistically significant when we looked at all of our matched pairs, but when we restricted it down to the first pair per patient, this was statistically significant. In our patient population, we actually only had one incident of occult hypoxemia, and we used the definition of the arterial saturation being less than 88 if the pulse ox reads 92 or higher. We only had one incident, and it actually happened to be in a patient with the lightest ITA category. We looked at it further with just those who had arterial blood gas saturation between 80 to 90%. And this is where we saw that the mean bias was actually positive with a slight overestimation of the arterial blood gas. Here I'm separating it out and showing you that the lighter patients in the circles and then the darker patients in the triangle there. When we looked at this relationship, we saw that the bias did increase or became more positive as the saturation lowered, but we did not see an effect with skin pigmentation when we applied that modification. So for our overall findings, we saw that the pulse oximetry overall underestimated the blood gas rather than overestimation, but this was primarily in the normoxemic range. And in our population, we didn't see a clinically meaningful pulse oximetry bias relative to skin pigmentation. But I do want to be cautious that we only used one specific device, so it might not be applicable to others. And then we had few patients with hypoxemia in that 80 to 90 range. And then our work was recently published, and I can put the link to that in the chat.
Thank you so much for sharing that. A couple of quick things. There's some chat going on or there's some discussion going on in the chat. I just put in there, would love for folks to start chiming in there as we keep going through the agenda. A big question has been, how much is too much bias to observe, differential bias to observe in the clinical setting? Is 0.5% too much, 1%, 1.5%, 2%? Like, what is that number? So would love to see folks' thoughts there, and maybe we can circle back to that. And then additionally, we are trying to keep track of, there's a lot of manuscripts coming out right now in this space, but we're trying to keep track of some of them. So if you have manuscripts that we should include in the OpenOx kind of manuscript library, please put those links in the chat. We'll make sure to include those in there as well. Moving on to our penultimate presenter, Dr. Tyler Law, over to you.
Hi there. All right, let me share the screen. Sorry, I don't know why the camera is not. There we go. Okay. Can see the slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about, I'm Tyler. I'm one of the anesthesiologists at UCSF. I work at the UCSF Hypoxia Lab. And I'll tell you about how we're utilizing some of our data so far. So we all know the problem. Don't need to spend too much time here about how do we understand the patients in which pulse oximeters don't always work accurately. And so the key question I think that is interesting to us right now is how could we tell in advance whether or not a pulse oximeter, a given pulse oximeter might work for a different patient? And in another way, can we predict before trusting the number which devices or when a device is likely to have some potential bias? So our goal for our coming study is to identify and predict patients at risk for incorrect measurements and to correct for them. So we have multi-phase ways of accomplishing this. Using our laboratory data, we'll try and develop and validate a phenotype-aware ML model. I'll tell you about the phenotypes in a minute. And then try and predict what the bias-corrected saturation might be in our cohort of laboratory volunteers. We'll validate this obviously offline and then online during our controlled desaturation studies and ensure it generalizes across different populations. And then a longer term goal would be to identify if the model can work outside the laboratory setting. To do this, we're going to be starting with our laboratory data, which is the controlled desaturation sessions from healthy volunteers. To give you a sense, we have right now, I was just looking about just over 1,000 controlled desaturation sessions from 277 individual subjects, and from one pulse oximeter around 28,000 paired SpO2, SaO2 measurements, obviously spanning, because they're controlled desaturation, spanning the range of saturations. We'll look at some of our OpenOx devices as well, although there are not 1,000 studies, 1,000 desaturation sessions with OpenOx devices. And then we'll include our raw EPG data that we've been collecting as well as the blood gases. So what we're doing is looking at phenotyping, and by that I want to try and describe the different types of patients in which how a pulse oximeter might react differently to different people. And so we've talked a lot about the bias pattern. So we're classifying people into our majority positive bias, negative bias, or neutral or inconsistent. And then I also want to look at outliers. We've started to look at outliers in terms of those people who are clearly behave differently than the population. By that, the population, I mean the cohort and their compatriots in the cohort that we're testing them with. Defined by their calibration curves and statistical deviation. And so we'll identify the outliers based on their slope in one measurement, following out the standard deviations from the population mean, the response curve there, the overall accuracy. And we talked about non-linearity, so whether or not they behave differently in different deciles, although that is probably a normal physiologic response. We started off by sort of looking at our overall cohort to get a sense of how it performs in terms of the kind of known modifying factors. You can see here that we have the percent mod, the perfusion index on the y-axis, and the ITA on the x-axis. And this is averaged by session level. So root mean square by at the individual session level. So not by the person, but by the desaturation session. And you can clearly see that we have that trend towards when the percent mod's low and the ITA gets low. That's where we start to have increased levels of error, but obviously not with perfect linearity. Looking at our bias directionality, it's been interesting, the discussion even in the chat from what Carolyn has said in EquiOx. What we have found is that overall in our cohort, we have majority of sessions or sorry, people, this is a subject level, not session level, are positive tilting. So they have over on average, 1% greater bias. Some people are neutral, meaning they're in between 1 and -1, and then only 15% of the cohort is a negative tilting bias. We did look a little bit at all the OpenOx devices in terms of their who are our outliers, and I'll just basically point your attention to the here. So 54 patient device pairs were flagged as outliers, meaning that their slope was a little bit off compared to the rest of the population. And so you can see that here's all of our OpenOx devices. But for instance, this, you can see there's two slopes here, so individual response curves that were different. I'll stop there. Our data is coming along as we go, but our next steps are to investigate the physiologic and skin color differences of the different outlier groups in our bias directionality cohorts as well.
Thanks, Tyler, for sharing. Obviously, a lot going on there. We are trying to share data in real time as always, but hopefully can get some of these updates out as well. But please reach out to Tyler if you have questions about what he's up to. We're almost on time. Pretty good given the number of talks. So thanks everyone so far, but we'll hand it over without delay to Bob and Sandy to take us home and share about the big achievement of getting ISO 8601 updated, which was recently released. So over to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead,
Mike.
Bob.
Sandy, you go ahead and lead out.
Well, you're sharing, Bob, from your computer. You got it up?
It's coming up. I just wanted you to share our thanks to Mike and team because that's where the bulk of our information of late has come from. So
Absolutely. And this is the unrehearsed Bob and Sandy show, so it might not go as smoothly as some of the other presentations.
well, don't immediately taint it, but we're gonna make the best out of this.
Yeah.
All right.
Why don't you go to the first slide?
And
Yep.
do you guys want to just introduce? I didn't do any intros, but just for people who don't know you that might be joining in, just a quick intro.
Sure. So I'm Sandy Weininger. I just retired from the FDA. I was there for 36 plus years doing product safety evaluations for electromedical devices. I wear an interoperability hat. And for the purposes of this discussion, Bob and I are the co-chairs of the joint working group ISO-IEC on pulse oximeters, or oximeters in general, of which pulse oximeters fall under that category. And I am the project lead for pulse oximetry. Bob, you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. So Sandy comes at this with primarily a safety engineer perspective. I say that because he is a PhD trained physicist, and this has been where he has been focused for those 35 years. And he's been brought into many, many reviews of devices from that perspective. I come in more from a clinical perspective. I'm a user of pulse oximeters and many other medical devices, critical care nurse, as well as a respiratory therapist. So have published a lot in the space of how can we make medical devices better, as well as what to do to establish minimum acceptance criteria so that people can understand the foibles of devices and yet be able to still work with them in the routine clinical environment, which clearly is different than a controlled laboratory setting. But the controlled laboratory setting is where the performance is established. So I'm going to take you to the next slide, which emphasizes a few factoids when it comes to this third edition. And if you just focus on the squares, you'll notice the first point is that this represents a a a release that occurred just this last month. And I want you to focus on another issue in that in the sea of pulse oximeters available throughout the world, this is specific to medical use. And we recognize there are a lot of other use cases. We're not going to address that here, but what we're addressing is medical use conditions for two specific areas. One, safety, as I've highlighted from Sandy's perspective, and the other will be dealing with performance, meaning how well does it perform against a known reference. Okay, so Sandy, this is over to you.
Yeah, so just briefly, the contributors and stakeholders to the standard are pretty diverse: patients, clinicians, teachers. You can read through the list. And as Bob said, we got an awful lot of data and information from Mike and team at OpenOx, as well as many other sources. And we tried to blend all that information into it and extract essentially, what are the hazardous situations that the pulse oximeter standard should address. Next, please, Bob. And so I just want to make a few points here in the interest of time. This is an engineering, if you will, design specification standard. It is not a clinical practice guideline. So it does not tell you, the clinician, what level of performance or accuracy you need for a particular clinical application. Right? It's designed to verify that a product delivers the specified performance that's claimed in the labeling, and at least from an FDA perspective, that the manufacturer claims when they do their regulatory submission. Now, the standards are used in lots of different ways around the world. In the US, FDA recognizes the standard, and that means that it stands in for, in fact, Bob, go to the next slide, please. It stands in for some particular aspect of the review process. And what you're looking at here is what's called an SIS, a supplemental information sheet. And it identifies the standard and the scope. But importantly, it says what the standard is not quote, recognized for. And in this particular case, this is the 2017 version. And it's showing that, because the standard said that an ARMS of 4% is an acceptable oximeter, and FDA disagreed with that. And so FDA said, well, that clause is not going to be recognized. The manufacturer will have to do better than that. I think it's now over to you, Bob. No, one more for me. The standard exists not all by itself, but in a quilt of safety. I'm on slide 6, please. There we go. Right at the center is the pulse oximeter standard that you can see, but above it is a quality system standard. I listed 13485, but you've heard people mention 17025. There's lots of different quality system standards out there. In the lower left corner is general risk management, 14970, 14971. In the lower right corner is the parent of what are called particular standards. This is a particular standard for pulse oximeters. And that's IEC 60601, which for decades has been trying to figure out what it means to be safe, right? So it's an amalgam of all these pieces stuck together to try to create a floor for basic safety and essential performance, which are terms of art. And again, these are engineering performances, not clinical. Bob, I think we're up to you on slide 7.
We are. Okay, so pardon, Sandy and I are working from a common deck, and so I had to keep an eye on where the slides were at simultaneously. So hopefully everyone can see what's being presented. The key to the most recent work, which really is recognize that this iteration of standard jumps from 2017 to 2026. The most active work in this space has occurred for about the last 6 years, 3 years of which we have leaned heavily on open oximetry in working together with FDA for sharing of data. Again, this is a CIRSE or FDA sponsored group of data, and we are ever so thankful that they are open access. And to that end, with any manufacturer, I recognize there were a few on the roster as I look through. Just, realize you can do a lot in pre-testing your data against some of those data already in that repository. So again, many thanks to the Open Oximetry team for adding to the science, objective science in this particular standard. Now, to that end, there are some main changes, 11 that we've identified. There are certainly more, but these are the main ones. And recognize it's not just improving what can be done from a SaO2 to SpO2 performance comparison, but as well to desktop or functional calibrator testing. So these functional testers are used for pulse rate. We're ignoring pulse rate in much of what we're saying, but recognize the pulse oximeter by the IEC and ISO standard are required to report just two variables. One is pulse rate, which again can be detected with a desktop type of testing device. And the other is SpO2, which has to meet a lot of other testing criteria, safety as well as performance. But when it comes to accuracy performance, it's all based upon adult volunteers being put into a controlled desaturation study over the declared range of a medical device pulse oximeter declared displayed saturation, so 70 to 100%. So this list obviously is taking in a lot of other issues. All right. So, what are already the known sources for variation? There are many, and the one that we already understood, and again, thanks to UCSF for much of their work in this space, going back really into the 80s, is knowing that the signal to noise ratio side of it leads to lower pulse intensity. And that's something that was not well understood before then. So it certainly contributes to the whole area of sources and what then is going to fall out from that. These are unranked in terms of their performance, but they are all well substantiated with existing medical literature. Sandy, over to you.
Sure. And as we've heard and as we've seen focused, the big issue that the standard tried to wrestle with, that the committee wrestled with, the standard's inanimate, although sometimes it feels like it's alive, that the committee tried to wrestle with is differential bias. And differential bias can arise from many different factors. Of course, the one that we're most interested in is pigmentation. And so the committee attempted to figure out a standardized way that when performance data is collected, it's comparable across manufacturers, across laboratories, across devices. And that's one of the big objectives. This standard is called a type test standard. That means that an individual device is put on the benchtop and tested. And what we try to do is establish means for making an apples to apples comparison. And I'll just point out there are some small differences between what's currently in the standard and what the upcoming FDA draft guidance might say. But as Mike says, I no longer have any visibility into that, and it's not out yet, so let's not talk about that. Okay, next slide, please. So differential bias, in the clinical question is, does it lead to disparate performance? The FDA guidance talks about disperformance. The standard talks about differential bias. And so, what are the sources of those differences? And how do we measure pigmentation? Where do you measure the pigmentation? And how should the standard describe what the acceptance criteria is? And how do you control variation? Right? And the Open Ox folks in UCSF have done a tremendous amount of work trying to figure out how you use pigmentation measurement systems and how you report that data and how you make it comparable. Next slide, please. And as an example, some of the ways that you may consider reporting the data, I have to make this bigger so I can see it. So you can see in the upper left corners, it tries to list by the different MST buckets, light, medium, and dark, against SaO2, right? And you can have SpO2. So now you can look at bias. In the upper right corner, you can see a means of looking at ITA versus bias. Right? So we tried not to abandon the manufacturers and the clinicians and people using it. The perspective of the standard is to try to give the tools to the stakeholders of the standard, the means to discern differences in performance, not to tell you what performance is acceptable for your particular clinical application, but to give you a comparable means for comparing Model A manufacturer to Model B manufacturer and trying to make some sense out of that. And so you can do procurement in an educated manner. Over. Next, Bob.
You bet. So this is, as Sandy has pointed out, currently a should condition. So if you go back to the prior slide, recognize when it comes to the differential bias that we at the IEC ISO level are saying that it should be less than 2.5% with a 95% CI centered between 80 and 90% at 85%. And why was all that selected? We were most aware of where the pulse oximeter might lead to an actionable clinician change. And so that's why it was selected at 85%. Okay, so that said, what's up next? Ability to get your hands on an IEC ISO standard and recognize those are two separate standards organizations throughout the world. These require paying for them, and we are interested in making sure that you can engage in making sure that we are hearing what you have in the way of input. And therefore, there's a public web portal that's being established. It'll be up with it before the end of the year. It's been hard for ISO to accept that they may get a little less money, but we are not sharing the standard. We're trying to make sure that those contributors and stakeholders are able to be involved at a collaborative level. In order to be involved as a committee member, there are more than 4 of them that are specialized experts in their area, between clinical and academics and regulatory, as well as engineering from manufacturers. But we need your input. So please, Sandy's and my emails are there for now. And once it goes live, you bet Mike is going to be well aware within open oximetry when that occurs. So that said, thank you. We're ready for questions.
Thanks, Bob and Sandy. We have 2 minutes left before the end of the session. We'll extend for 10 minutes, so we won't cut people off. For those who have time, please stick around. There's a lot of discussion going on here, but any specific questions for as we're kind of wrapping up? Any specific questions for Bob and Sandy since they just finished, or for any of the other reviewers or presenters, rather? Sorry. And feel free to either raise your hand or just go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask.
I have one quick one for FDA simulator testing. What co-oximeter was used for your testing of bovine blood? I'll leave it alone. I'll just send her or Josh a separate email.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Well, go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions. Otherwise, I'm going to move forward with kind of wrapping us up here. Thanks to all the presenters again. So it sounds like there's a lot of data. There's a lot of studies also I can see in the chat that are going to be coming out with new data, which is really exciting. I know Ash, Brady, several others are doing stuff, especially in light of the mixed findings that we're having. It may be just thinking out loud. They're one of the subgroups of the collaborative community was a clinical trials group. It could be a good timing to come back now with new data out and think through what are best practices for these studies. How could we, all of the limitations that we're all seeing in our own studies, how could we come together with some recommendations for future studies to try and address those? It's been a lot of effort that everybody's put in over the last couple of years, and we're still kind of scratching our heads a little bit and don't have perfect answers. So it would be nice to sit down now and, not be 3 years down the road having the same discussion around, oh, I wish we had done things slightly differently. So that's one thought. Lots of steps towards improving that diversity of skin pigment, thanks to Ellis and many others working in that space. So congrats, Ellis, on that. But it also sounds like maybe there's still some work to do. ITA, imperfect approaches. We're raising the bar, but we're not there yet. So we shouldn't let off the gas. Is that accurate, Ellis?
Very accurate. Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And don't forget to reach out to Ellis if you are interested in getting the new Pantone printed scale.
That's right.
Okay, great. Thanks. Lots happening in the labs. OpenOx and other labs are doing testing. The new lab in Uganda is operational, which hopefully will contribute some much needed data in this space, not only for sponsored studies, but also just for independent research purposes. The work on the phantoms is really interesting to see. I think all of it kind of continues to highlight that there is this gap between what's happening in the lab, whether a phantom or controlled DSAT studies, and what's happening in the real world, especially across different patient populations, adult, neonates. So this is still a big area to continue to discuss. Regulatory changes are happening, they're in process. And Sandy, forgive me if I'm misparaphrasing, but there still is potentially a gap where there needs to be better communication of something directly to the clinicians for how to, whether it's clinical practice guidelines or otherwise, to determine what is an acceptable level of performance for your specific use case. If that's in the neonatal ICU or congenital cardiac screening, or managing acute respiratory failure in adults, there needs to be some more work done in that space. And so I could see that being another area for discussion in this forum. So with that, go ahead.
My own personal peeve or soapbox that I usually climb up on is, expecting an oximeter to have a perfect performance, zero variance, is a little unrealistic. In fact, we know that roughly 1/3 of the results the measurements are going to be off by plus or minus ARMS, right? And so if you have 100 patients, that's going to be a significant number of your patients. But all the clinical practice guidelines come out as if they're set in stone and no uncertainty at all. And you sprinkle on top of that the differences in co-oximeter performance. Right now, if you're trying to match up your device and say, well, I'm going to take a co-oximeter value and verify that my pulse oximeter is working. Well, you kind of have to know what the oximeter that your device was originally proven on. And so there's just a lot of different parameters and uncertainties floating around. And I don't want to hang the oximeter uh, by itself.
Sounds good. And Bob, I see your hand, but Heather, I saw your hand was up a second ago. Did you want to make a comment as well? And then we can go over to Bob.
No, that was actually accidental hand raising that I did twice now. My apologies.
Got it. No problem. No problem. Bob, over to you.
Heather, I greatly appreciated as an ex-NICU PICU nurse that there are some objective data in this space in real world use cases. And obviously, Carolyn, I've certainly spoke highly of that, your work too. Being able to accomplish that at the General was amazing with your team. But I do want to point out that these devices are simply a indirect measure of pulse rate and SpO2. They are the best estimate that could be gained from a manufacturer, largely empirically, by comparing it against a benchtop device for pulse rate and controlled adult healthy volunteers being exposed to desaturation studies. So, uh, I, although perhaps flawed at some level, they are at least controlled conditions. And when things go to real world and clinicians may have malplaced a sensor or maybe the device is just not working well, the clinician is the arbiter. They're the ones that should be able to say, the clinical condition doesn't match what I'm seeing on this device. Don't accept the device. Go in and do something to corroborate it, such as taking a pulse or getting a blood gas for functional oxygenation saturation. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Bob. All right. Well, I see a handful of great discussion that's been happening in the chat. We're going to follow up with folks who have put ideas in here for future studies or future forum meetings. Thank you to all of our presenters today for joining. Thanks to everybody for hanging in. Again, a special thanks to Lily Ortiz for helping us get this meeting together. And we look forward to the next one. Sorry it's been a while, but we hope to see everybody soon so we can keep things moving in this space. With that, have a good rest of your day or evening. Take care.